London, 1819. The crystal chandeliers of Ashford House blazed with 1,000 candles, casting their golden radiance upon the pinnacle of the season, the sovereign's grand ball. Silk gowns in jeweled tones swirled across the polished marble floor as the cream of society moved in perfect, practiced harmony. The air hummed with music, laughter, and the sharp currency of reputation. Yet near the towering windows overlooking the gardens, Miss Aveline Holloway stood alone, a silent figure in a gown of pale blue muslin that had seen 2 seasons already. At 20, she had long since accepted her role as the cautionary tale whispered behind fans, the girl who had been rejected. Not that anyone watching the glittering throng would guess her connection to the animated group near the orchestra, where her younger sister, Marianne, laughed with effortless charm, surrounded by admirers. The Holloway name still carried weight, though that weight was now measured in debts rather than distinction. "Your sister appears in fine spirits tonight," came a familiar voice. Aveline turned to find Mrs. Pemberton, her late mother's closest friend, standing beside her with a glass of champagne and an expression of studied concern. "Marianne has always possessed a talent for brightness," Aveline replied carefully. "Indeed." Mrs. Pemberton's sharp eyes swept the ballroom. One might never guess that Holloway Manor teeters on the edge of ruin. Aveline's fingers tightened imperceptibly on her fan. Few knew the true depth of their troubles, that her father's investments in a failed shipping venture had consumed what remained of their capital, that creditors had begun sending letters, that the modest dowry her mother had set aside for her had been quietly spent to fund Marianne's debut. "We manage, Mrs. Pemberton." "Do you?" The older woman's voice dropped. "My dear, the whispers have already begun. Your father's notes are being called in. One scandal, one public slight tonight, and no gentleman, not even the modest country squire you've been courting, will have you. The Holloway name will be worthless." A cold knot formed in Aveline's chest. She had come tonight with a single, desperate purpose: to secure Mr. Thomas Waverley's proposal. He was a second son with a comfortable living, no title, no pretensions. He had seemed kindly disposed toward her despite her past. It would be enough. It had to be enough. Across the ballroom, she caught sight of her father. At 52, Lord Holloway retained traces of the handsome man who had once been welcomed in every drawing room in London, though years of disappointment had carved lines around his mouth and left a slight tremor in his hands. Since her mother's death 3 years ago, he had become increasingly reckless, chasing recovery through increasingly risky ventures, each more disastrous than the last. Tonight, his face was flushed with wine as he spoke too loudly to a group of gentlemen who were already edging away. "I must find Mr. Waverley," Aveline said quietly. "Before, father." The orchestra abruptly shifted into a new melody. The change was subtle, but the effect was immediate. Conversations faltered. Dancers slowed. The entire ballroom seemed to draw a collective breath as the crowd near the entrance parted like a silk curtain drawn aside. "His Grace, the Duke of Wrentham," announced the footman, his voice carrying through the sudden, profound silence. Damien Hartwell, the 8th Duke of Wrentham, stood framed in the doorway like a figure carved from shadow and stone. At 31, he commanded attention not merely through his ancient title, one of only 5 dukedoms in England, but through the formidable, almost unsettling presence he carried. Tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in severe black evening clothes that made no concession to fashion's flourishes, he surveyed the assembly with eyes the color of storm clouds. His features were striking, almost brutal in their masculine severity: high cheekbones, a strong jaw, a mouth that looked as though it rarely smiled. "Good Lord," breathed Mrs. Pemberton. I didn't think he would actually come. His Grace hasn't attended a society ball in 3 years." Aveline watched as a visible ripple moved through the room. Mothers with unmarried daughters straightened almost imperceptibly. Young ladies adjusted their curls and assumed their most practiced expressions of demure charm, but there was something different in the reaction to the Duke of Wrentham. Not the eager anticipation that greeted other eligible peers, but something closer to wariness, even fear. "They say he's finally seeking a wife," whispered a young woman nearby, her voice carrying in the hushed room. "Some legal matter requiring immediate marriage." "Lady Beatrice Ashford has been positioned all season," her companion replied, "though I've heard he barely acknowledges her existence." "A duke doesn't marry just anyone," the first woman said with certainty. "Certainly not someone compromised." Aveline felt the familiar shame burn through her chest. 2 years ago, she had been publicly, spectacularly rejected by Viscount Rothwell at a ball not unlike this one. He had asked her to dance, had led her to believe an understanding existed between them, and then had announced his engagement to another woman in front of half of London society. The humiliation had been absolute, her reputation irrevocable. She forced herself to look away from the Duke, to scan the room for Mr. Waverley. There, near the refreshment table. If she could just reach him, remind him of their conversation last week. Perhaps secure a private word. "Miss Holloway, there you are." Aveline's heart sank as she recognized the voice. Lady Clarissa Montrose glided toward her, resplendent in emerald silk, her beautiful face arranged in an expression of false concern. They had been friends once, before the rejection. Before Clarissa had decided that association with Aveline was a liability. "Lady Clarissa," Aveline curtsied, keeping her voice neutral. "I'm surprised to see you here tonight." Clarissa's voice was loud enough to carry, and heads were already turning. "After last season's difficulties, I thought perhaps you would spare yourself the ordeal of another ball." Mrs. Pemberton stiffened beside her, but Aveline had learned to endure these small cruelties with composure. "The Ashfords were kind enough to extend an invitation." "Oh, the Ashfords are kind to everyone," Clarissa said with a tinkling laugh. "Though I confess, I saw Mr. Waverley earlier, and he seemed quite taken with Miss Hartwell. Such a suitable match for a gentleman of his standing, don't you think? Someone unblemished." The word struck like a slap. Aveline felt the familiar heat of humiliation crawl up her neck. Several guests had stopped dancing entirely now, watching with the avid attention society reserved for public spectacles. This was exactly what she had feared. Another moment of exposure, another confirmation of her unworthiness. "I'm certain Mr. Waverley's choices are his own concern," Aveline managed, though her voice had lost its steadiness. Of course. Clarissa tilted her head with false sympathy. "Though one must be realistic about one's prospects, mustn't one? After all, a rejected woman can hardly—" "Lady Clarissa." The voice was deep, cold, and cut through the conversation like a blade through silk. Every word in the ballroom died. Every eye turned. The Duke of Wrentham stood 3 paces away, his expression as remote and impassive as granite. But his storm-gray eyes were fixed not on Clarissa, but on Aveline. Clarissa's face went pale. "Your Grace, The Duke didn't acknowledge her. He moved forward with deliberate, unhurried purpose, his gaze never leaving Aveline's face. The crowd parted before him as though pulled by invisible strings. Aveline's heart hammered against her ribs. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. He stopped directly before her. Up close, he was even more imposing, tall enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes, broad enough to block out the rest of the ballroom. His presence was overwhelming, almost suffocating in its intensity. And then, without asking permission, without preamble, he reached out and took her hand. His touch was warm, firm, possessive. Aveline gasped. The Duke turned his head slightly, directing his words toward Clarissa, though his eyes remained locked on Aveline. When he spoke, his voice carried across the now utterly silent ballroom with absolute, unquestionable authority. "You are addressing my future Duchess, Lady Clarissa. I suggest you find somewhere else to direct your attention." The world tilted. Aveline stared up at him, her mind unable to process what she had just heard. Around them, the silence was so complete she could hear the rustle of her own gown, the rapid thunder of her own heartbeat. The Duke's expression didn't change. His hand tightened fractionally on hers, a claim, not a request. "Miss Holloway," he said, his voice dropping to a tone meant only for her, though every ear in the ballroom was straining to hear. "You will dance with me." It was not a question. He turned, drawing her with him toward the center of the floor. The crowd scattered before them like leaves before a storm. The orchestra, as if released from a spell, began to play. Aveline moved as though in a dream, her feet following the steps automatically while her mind reeled. The Duke's hand settled at her waist with confident possession. His other hand held hers firmly. They began to move, and the rest of the ballroom seemed to fall away. "Your Grace, I don't understand," Aveline whispered, her voice trembling. "You will," he said quietly, his eyes boring into hers with an intensity that stole what remained of her breath. "But not here." Around them, the ton watched in stunned silence as the Duke of Wrentham, the cold, untouchable Duke who had rejected every match, who had shown nothing but disdain for society's games, danced with the rejected maiden. And Aveline Holloway realized, with a dizzying mixture of terror and impossible hope, that her entire world had just shifted on its axis. Her rejection had just led to her claim. "My lovely family, before we continue with Aveline's transformation, I need to ask you something. If you're enjoying this story of a rejected woman finding her true worth, but you haven't subscribed yet, you're telling YouTube you don't want to see more stories like this. The algorithm will hide my next upload from you, and trust me, you don't want to miss what happens when the brooding Duke meets his match. Hit that subscribe button now. Like and share this video, because I'd hate for you to lose access to the passionate conclusion of this story. And tell me in the comments where you are watching from." The waltz ended, but the Duke did not release her. His hand remained at her waist, proprietary and unyielding, as he guided her through the frozen tableau of shocked guests toward the terrace doors. Aveline's mind spun with 1,000 questions, but her voice had abandoned her entirely. She could feel every eye in the ballroom burning into her back, could hear the explosion of whispers that erupted the moment they passed. The night air struck her face like cold water. The terrace was mercifully empty, the strains of music and gasps of scandal muffled behind the glass doors. The Duke released her finally, moving to stand at the stone balustrade, his broad back to her as he surveyed the darkened gardens below. Aveline pressed a trembling hand to her chest, trying to slow her racing heart. "Your Grace, I must insist on an explanation. What you said in there, what you did, was necessary." He turned to face her, his expression still maddeningly unreadable. "Sit down, Miss Holloway. You look as though you might faint." "I am not going to faint," she said, though her legs felt decidedly unsteady. "I am going to demand that you tell me why you just announced to all of London that I am to be your Duchess when we have never even been introduced. Something that might have been amusement flickered across his severe features. We were introduced. Approximately 4 minutes ago. That is not... Aveline stopped, drawing in a breath and forcing herself to think clearly despite the chaos in her mind. Your Grace, this is madness. You cannot simply declare a betrothal that does not exist. I can, he said with absolute certainty. I just did. The casual arrogance of it stole her breath. But why? You don't know me. You cannot possibly want to marry me. Want has nothing to do with it. He moved closer, and she had to steel herself not to retreat from the sheer intensity of his presence. I need a wife, Miss Holloway. Immediately. A wife who is not entangled in society's ambitions, who will not make demands beyond the arrangement, and who will serve the practical purpose required of her. The bluntness struck her like a physical blow. I see. And you selected me because I am so thoroughly ruined that I should be grateful for any offer, no matter how coldly presented. His eyes narrowed fractionally. I selected you because you are desperate, yes. Your father owes £17,000 to creditors who will call in those debts within a fortnight. Your sister's prospects depend entirely on maintaining the appearance of solvency. You came here tonight hoping to secure a marriage to Thomas Waverley, a man whose income is barely sufficient to maintain his own household, much less rescue yours. Aveline stared at him, the accuracy of his knowledge more unsettling than anything else he had said. How could you possibly? I make it my business to know things. He clasped his hands behind his back, his stance that of a general delivering terms of surrender. I need a wife to secure a legal claim to the Thornwood estates. My rival, Lord Fenris, is challenging the inheritance through a technicality that can only be resolved through marriage. The solicitors assure me that a wife of unimpeachable character, with no connections to Fenris or his faction, will suffice to validate my claim. Unimpeachable character? A bitter laugh escaped her. Your Grace, I am the rejected maiden. My character has been impeached by all of society. Your character, he said with cold precision, was impeached by the malicious act of a vain boy who chose spectacle over honor. That is not the same as actual moral failing. You have no gambling debts, no scandalous liaisons, no political entanglements. You are, in the eyes of the law, exactly what I require. The transactional nature of his words should have wounded her. Perhaps they did. But beneath the shock, beneath the surreal impossibility of this conversation, a cold, practical part of her mind was already calculating £17,000, her father's debts, Marianne's future, the humiliation she had endured tonight from Clarissa, the pity in Mrs. Pemberton's eyes, the way Mr. Waverley had avoided her gaze when she had finally spotted him dancing with another woman. What, precisely, are you proposing? She asked, her voice steadier than she felt. A marriage. A real one, legal and binding, but contractual in nature. He spoke as though negotiating a business arrangement, which, she supposed, he was. You will become the Duchess of Wrentham. Your father's debts will be paid in full. Your sister will have a dowry sufficient to make a brilliant match. You will have the protection of my name and position, and you will never again be subjected to the cruelty you endured tonight. And in return, you will fulfill the role of Duchess, manage my household, appear at my side when required. You will not interfere in my business affairs, you will not make emotional demands, and you will not expect a conventional marriage. The clinical detachment in his voice should have made her refuse outright. This was madness. A stranger offering a loveless arrangement, reducing her to a legal instrument in some property dispute she didn't understand. And yet, "Your Grace," she said slowly, "why not simply choose Lady Beatrice Ashford, or any of a dozen titled ladies who would leap at the chance to be Duchess of Wrentham? Why choose someone you claim is desperate?" For the first time, something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, precisely, but a kind of grim honesty. "Because those women would expect things I cannot give. Affection, romance, the pretense of a love match. You, Miss Holloway, understand what it means to have your expectations destroyed. You know that security is worth more than sentiment." The truth of it cut deeper than she wanted to admit. He was right. She had learned that lesson in the cruelest way possible. "I need an answer, Miss Holloway." His voice had lost none of its commanding edge. "Your father's creditors will not wait, and I must secure the Thornwood claim before the quarter's end. 3 weeks from tonight, I will either have a wife, or I will lose an estate that has been in my family for 2 centuries. Aveline looked back through the terrace doors at the ballroom beyond. She could see the guests still clustered in agitated groups, doubtless dissecting every moment of what they had witnessed. Lady Clarissa stood among them, her face a mask of fury and shock. Her father was visible near the card room, his expression one of desperate hope as he craned to see where she had gone. She thought of Holloway Manor, of the letters from creditors her father had tried to hide, of Marianne's bright laughter that would die if their name was destroyed. She thought of the endless humiliations of the past 2 years, and the certainty that tonight had been her last chance at even a modest escape. The Duke of Wrentham was offering her salvation, not happiness, perhaps, but protection, security, an end to the cruelty. She turned back to face him, this cold stranger who had just upended her entire world. "If I agree," she said quietly, "I need your word that my family will be provided for. Not just the debts paid, but real security. My sister's dowry, a pension for my father." Done. And I want it in writing, before the wedding. His mouth curved in what might have been approval. "Agreed. Anything else?" "Yes." She lifted her chin, meeting his storm-gray eyes with as much dignity as she could summon. "If I am to be your Duchess in name and law, you will treat me with respect. I will not be humiliated again, Your Grace. Not even by you." Something flickered in his gaze, surprise perhaps, or recognition. "You have my word, Miss Holloway. I do not require a wife I can break. I require one who can endure." It was not a declaration of love. It was not even kind. But it was honest. And honesty was something Aveline had learned to value above pretty lies. She extended her hand, trembling only slightly. "Then I accept your proposal, Your Grace." His hand closed around hers, warm and strong and utterly certain. "Then it is settled. You will be the Duchess of Wrentham." The Duke's carriage was as severe as the man himself. Black lacquered wood with no crest visible in the darkness. The interior upholstered in dark leather that smelled of tobacco and old parchment. Aveline sat rigidly on one side while Damien occupied the other, his long legs stretched out with casual possession of the space. Through the window, she watched the lights of Ashford House recede into the distance, aware that she was leaving behind everything familiar for something utterly unknown. "We will need to move quickly," Damien said, his voice cutting through the rhythmic clatter of hooves on cobblestone. "I've instructed my solicitor to draw up the settlement papers tonight. You will review them tomorrow morning." Aveline turned from the window to find him watching her with that same unsettling intensity. "Tomorrow morning?" Your Grace, I haven't even told my father. Your father knows. He pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket and handed it to her. I sent word to him before I left the ballroom. He has agreed to the match. She unfolded the paper with trembling fingers. Her father's handwriting sprawled across the page in his characteristic mixture of pride and desperation. His Grace has made an offer that secures our family's future. You must accept, Aveline. You must. The word must was underlined 3 times. You orchestrated all of this before you even spoke to me, she said slowly, a cold realization settling over her. The dramatic entrance, the public declaration, it was all planned. Not planned. Expedited. He leaned back against the leather seat, his expression unchanged. I learned of your situation 3 days ago. I learned of Lord Fenris's challenge to the Thornwood deed 2 weeks before that. When I discovered you would be at the Ashford ball, I saw an opportunity to resolve both problems simultaneously. The casual calculation of it should have frightened her. Perhaps it did. But there was something almost reassuring in his brutal honesty, as though he had stripped away all the pretty deception that usually accompanied courtship and left only the bare framework of necessity. Tell me about Lord Fenris, she said. If I am to be part of this transaction, I should understand what I'm being used to prevent. Something that might have been approval flickered in his eyes. Marcus Fenris holds the neighboring estate to Thornwood. 20 years ago, my father won a significant portion of land from Fenris's father in a card game. The deed was transferred legally, but the language was imprecise. Now Fenris claims that because my father died without a direct heir producing children, the land should revert to his family. But you are the heir. I am the heir, but I am unmarried. Fenris's solicitors have found an obscure codicil that states the land can only be held by a man of established household. They argue that without a wife, I do not constitute an established household. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. It is legal sophistry, but the magistrate is sympathetic to Fenris. I need to present a wife and a legitimate household before the hearing in 3 weeks, or I lose 2,000 acres and the income they generate. Aveline absorbed this, her mind working through the implications. So, any wife would do. You simply need to be married. Not any wife. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze sharpening. Fenris has spent the last 2 years cultivating relationships with every ambitious family in London. If I marry one of the eligible daughters currently angling for my title, there is a strong possibility she has connections to Fenris or his faction. They could claim the marriage was arranged under his influence, or find some other technicality to exploit. I need a wife with no political entanglements, no social ambition, and no reason to ally with my enemies. A wife who is desperate enough to accept whatever terms you offer, Aveline finished quietly. A wife who has been so thoroughly rejected by society that she has nowhere else to turn. He didn't flinch from the bitterness in her voice. Yes. The carriage turned onto a wider street, and gas lamps threw moving shadows across his angular face. Aveline studied him, this stranger who had appeared like some dark specter and claimed her with a handful of words. There was no softness in him, no attempt to gentle the transaction with romantic pretense. And yet, there was also no cruelty in his directness. He was offering her exactly what she needed, even if the terms were cold as winter stone. What happened? She asked abruptly. To make you like this? His expression shuddered immediately. That is not relevant to our arrangement. Perhaps not. But if we are to be married, even in name only, I should like to know what manner of man I am binding myself to. For a long moment, he said nothing. The carriage swayed through a turn, and somewhere in the distance, church bells tolled midnight. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its hard edge, replaced by something flat and distant. 5 years ago, I was engaged to a woman named Catherine Aldridge. Beautiful, accomplished, from an excellent family. I believed we had an understanding based on mutual respect and compatible temperaments. He paused, his gaze fixed on something beyond the carriage window. 3 weeks before the wedding, I discovered she had been passing information about my business dealings to a competitor. She had been placed in my path deliberately, cultivated to gain my trust, and she had done so with remarkable efficiency. The betrayal cost me a shipping contract worth £30,000 and taught me a valuable lesson about the dangers of sentiment. The pain beneath the clinical recitation was carefully buried, but Aveline heard it anyway. She recognized it. The same careful control she had learned to maintain after her own public humiliation. "So you decided never to trust again," she said softly. "I decided never to be foolish again." His eyes snapped back to hers, sharp and challenging. "Trust is a luxury I cannot afford, Miss Holloway. What I can afford is clarity. A contractual arrangement with defined terms and no false expectations. You need security and protection. I need a wife who serves a legal purpose without requiring emotional investment. It is a fair exchange." The carriage was slowing now, and Aveline realized they had arrived at her family's townhouse in Russell Square. The building looked shabbier than she remembered, the paint peeling slightly around the windows, evidence of the economies her father had been forced to make. Damien reached into his coat and withdrew a small leather folder. "Inside you will find a bank draft for £500. It is an advance against your household accounts as Duchess. Use it to purchase whatever you need for the wedding and the journey to Wrentham Hall. My solicitor will call on you at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning with the settlement papers. Read them carefully. If you have any objections, make them known then, not later." Aveline took the folder with numb fingers, the weight of it tangible proof that this was actually happening. "When is the wedding to be?" 4 days hence. Special license. Private ceremony at Wrentham Chapel." He reached past her to open the carriage door, and she caught the scent of sandalwood and something darker, like smoke. "I will not see you again until then. My staff will manage all the arrangements." She should move, should step down from the carriage and into whatever future she had just agreed to. But something held her in place, some last vestige of the girl who had once believed in romance and happy endings. "Your Grace," she said quietly, "what if this doesn't work? What if Lord Fenris finds some other way to challenge the deed? Or what if—" "It will work." The absolute certainty in his voice left no room for doubt. "I do not fail, Miss Holloway. Not at business, and not at this." It was not comfort. It was not reassurance. It was simply fact, delivered with the same cold precision as everything else he had said. And somehow, that was enough. Aveline stepped down from the carriage into the cool night air. She turned back to look at him one last time, this stranger who would become her husband. He sat in shadow, only his eyes visible, watching her with that same unreadable intensity. 4 days, she repeated. 4 days, he confirmed. And then you will be the Duchess of Wrentham. The carriage door closed, and the horses moved forward, carrying him away into the darkness. Aveline stood alone on the steps of her family's failing townhouse, a leather folder worth £500 in her hands and a future she could barely comprehend waiting for her. Inside the folder, beneath the bank draft, she found a single card with 2 words written in bold, masculine script. Trust clarity. The morning additions arrived before breakfast, and with them, the confirmation that Aveline's life had been irrevocably altered. She sat in the cramped morning room of the Russell Square townhouse. 3 different scandal sheets spread across the tea table, each one screaming variations of the same impossible headline. The Duke's astonishing choice. Wrentham claims the rejected maiden. A shocking reversal. Miss Holloway's spectacular salvation from scandal to Duchess. The season's most unexpected match. Her sister Marianne perched on the edge of the settee, reading over her shoulder with unconcealed delight. Listen to this one. In a display that left the ton breathless, His Grace the Duke of Wrentham publicly declared Miss Aveline Holloway his intended bride, transforming her status from society's cautionary tale to its most enviable woman in the space of a single waltz. She looked up, eyes shining. Aveline, you're famous. Infamous, more like, Aveline murmured, though she couldn't deny the strange, dizzying sensation of reading her own name attached to the Duke's in print. 4 days ago, she had been invisible. Now she was the subject of every breakfast conversation in London. Her father entered the room with uncharacteristic energy, his face flushed with triumph rather than wine for the first time in months. The Duke's men were here at dawn. The debts are paid, Aveline, all of them. And there's more, a settlement of £20,000 for Marianne's dowry, and a pension for me of $1,200 a year. His voice cracked slightly. You've saved us. You've saved everything. Aveline felt the weight of his gratitude like a physical thing, pressing down on her shoulders. She had done what was necessary, what any dutiful daughter would do. The fact that her marriage would be a cold, contractual arrangement was a price only she would pay. The door knocker sounded, sharp and insistent. Moments later, Mrs. Pemberton swept into the room without waiting to be announced, a copy of the Morning Chronicle clutched in her gloved hand. The entire city is ablaze with speculation, she announced, settling into a chair with the air of someone preparing to deliver crucial intelligence. Lady Ashford is claiming she suspected the Duke's interest all along. Lady Clarissa has taken to her bed with a headache. And Lord Rothwell, she paused significantly, Lord Rothwell is said to be positively green with regret. The mention of the man who had rejected her so publicly 2 years ago should have brought satisfaction. Instead, Aveline felt only a distant, detached curiosity. That humiliation belonged to a different girl, one who had believed in love and propriety and the goodness of gentlemen's intentions. The wedding is tomorrow, she said quietly. Private ceremony. I leave for Wrentham Hall immediately after. Mrs. Pemberton's expression softened with something that might have been concern. My dear, are you certain about this? The Duke has a formidable reputation. They say he is cold as winter frost, that he has no heart at all. Then we are well matched, Aveline replied, with more sharpness than she intended. For mine has already been broken. The wedding took place at noon in the private chapel at Wrentham House, the Duke's London residence, a massive stone edifice in Mayfair that seemed designed to intimidate rather than welcome. The ceremony itself was brief and utterly devoid of sentiment. The vicar spoke the ancient words with nervous haste, clearly uncomfortable with the Duke's severe presence. Her father gave her away with tears streaming down his face. Marianne served as her only attendant, dressed in borrowed finery that the Duke's housekeeper had somehow procured overnight. Damien stood beside her in charcoal gray, his expression as remote as carved marble. When he spoke his vows, his voice was steady and utterly emotionless, as though he were reading terms of a business contract rather than pledging his life to another person. Aveline matched his tone precisely, her own voice clear and calm. This was a transaction. They both understood that. When the vicar pronounced them man and wife, Damien turned to her with the same calculated precision he brought to everything else. His kiss was brief, formal, the merest brush of his lips against hers. And yet, even that minimal contact sent an unexpected shock through her system, a crackling awareness that left her momentarily breathless. His eyes met hers for just a moment, and she saw something flicker in their gray depths. Surprise, perhaps? Or recognition of the same unexpected current that had jolted through her. Then it was over. She was the Duchess of Wrentham. Damien produced a small velvet box from his coat pocket as they stood in the chapel vestibule, their few witnesses departing around them. "This belonged to my grandmother," he said, opening it to reveal a heavy signet ring worked in gold and onyx, the Wrentham crest carved into its face. "It is traditionally given to the Duchess upon marriage." He took her hand, that same possessive grip from the ballroom, and slid the ring onto her right hand. It was too large, meant for a woman with broader fingers, and the weight of it felt strange and foreign against her skin. "It represents duty," he said, his voice low and inflectionless. "Not affection. I want no misunderstanding between us, Aveline." It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his deep voice did something unsettling to her composure. "I understand perfectly, Your Grace." "Damien," he corrected. "We are married. You will use my name." "Damien," she repeated, testing the intimacy of it. "And you may call me Aveline." Something shifted in his expression, too subtle to name. "The carriage is ready. We leave for Wrentham Hall within the hour." The journey north took 6 hours, and they spent it in near silence. Damien occupied himself with correspondence, his attention focused on papers covered in dense legal text. Aveline watched the countryside roll past and tried to imagine what her life would be like in the remote estate that was now her home. They arrived at Wrentham Hall as dusk was falling, and Aveline's first glimpse of it stole what remained of her composure. It was enormous, a sprawling manor house of gray stone that seemed to have grown organically from the surrounding moorland, all severe lines and imposing towers. No welcoming lights blazed in the windows. No warmth emanated from its facade. It looked exactly like the man who owned it. The staff assembled in the great hall to meet their new mistress, a formidable housekeeper named Mrs. Davies, a stern-faced butler, and a dozen others whose names blurred together in Aveline's exhausted mind. Damien introduced her with the same businesslike efficiency he brought to everything else, then excused himself to attend to estate matters, leaving her alone with strangers in a house that felt more like a mausoleum than a home. Mrs. Davies showed her to the Duchess's chambers, a vast suite of rooms decorated in deep burgundy and gold, beautiful but utterly impersonal. "His Grace's rooms adjoin yours through that door," the housekeeper said, gesturing to a heavy oak door set into the far wall. "Shall I have your things unpacked, Your Grace?" "Your Grace." The title still sounded like it belonged to someone else. "Yes, thank you, Mrs. Davies." The housekeeper curtsied and withdrew, leaving Aveline alone in the cavernous bedroom. She moved to the window and looked out over the darkening moors, feeling unmoored and strange, as though she had stepped into someone else's life entirely. She didn't hear the adjoining door open, didn't sense his presence until his voice cut through the silence. "You should rest. Dinner will be served at 8. Aveline turned to find Damien standing in the doorway between their rooms. He had removed his coat and cravat, and the sight of him in just his shirt and waistcoat did something peculiar to her breathing. The fine linen clung to the broad planes of his chest and shoulders, revealing the powerful build beneath his usually severe clothing. "I'm not tired," she said, though it was a lie. She was exhausted, wrung out from the whirlwind of the past 4 days. He moved into the room with that same predatory grace she had noticed at the ball. Nevertheless, this has been a trying day. You should what? The question came out sharper than she intended, fueled by 4 days of being managed and directed and told what she must do. Rest? Adjust? Accept my new circumstances with appropriate gratitude? He stopped, his eyes narrowing. I thought we had an understanding. We do. She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze directly. A contractual arrangement. Duty, not affection. I am to be your duchess in name and law, serving my purpose while expecting nothing of emotional substance in return. I understand the terms perfectly, Damien. Something dangerous flickered in his expression. He closed the distance between them in 3 long strides. And suddenly he was standing far too close, near enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could see the muscle ticking in his jaw. Do you? His voice had dropped to something low and rough. Do you truly understand what you've agreed to? Her heart hammered against her ribs. Enlighten me. His hand came up to cup her jaw, his thumb brushing across her lower lip with deliberate, shocking intimacy. The touch sent fire racing through her veins, awakening something fierce and hungry that she hadn't known existed within her. You are my wife, he said, each word precise and weighted. That means you share my name, my home, and my bed. The contract stipulates many things, Aveline, but it does not stipulate a celibate marriage. She should have been frightened, should have pulled away from his touch, from the dark intensity burning in his eyes. Instead, she found herself swaying toward him, drawn by a force she didn't fully comprehend. I didn't expect it to, she whispered. His control shattered. Morning came too early, pale winter light filtering through the heavy burgundy drapes of the Duchess's chambers. Aveline woke alone, the space beside her, in the massive 4-poster bed, already cold. Damien had risen before dawn. She had heard him moving about in his adjoining rooms, the low murmur of his voice as he spoke with his valet. Then silence, and the distant sound of hoofbeats on gravel as he rode out across the estate. He had not said goodbye. Aveline pushed herself upright, her body aching in unfamiliar ways that brought a flush to her cheeks even in the privacy of her empty chamber. Last night had been. She had no words for what it had been. Fierce and consuming, and utterly devoid of the tender romance she had once imagined accompanied marital intimacy. Damien had claimed her with the same intense focus he brought to everything else, demanding and possessive and breathtakingly thorough. And she had met him with equal ferocity, surprised by the hunger he had awakened in her. But when it was over, when their breathing had finally slowed and their bodies had cooled, he had simply risen, pressed a brief kiss to her temple, the only gesture of tenderness he had offered, and retreated to his own rooms without a word. Duty, not affection. She would do well to remember that. A soft knock at the door announced the arrival of her new lady's maid, a capable-looking woman in her 30s named Peters. Good morning, Your Grace. Mrs. Davies requests your presence in the housekeeper's sitting room at your earliest convenience. There are household matters requiring the Duchess's attention. Of course there were. Aveline had married a duke, which meant she had also married an enterprise, an enormous estate with dozens of staff, tenant farms, and generations of tradition that now rested partially on her shoulders. She dressed in a simple morning gown of gray wool, far plainer than anything a duchess should wear, but serviceable and warm. Wrentham Hall was drafty and cold despite the fires burning in every grate, as though the stone itself resisted warmth. She followed Peters through a bewildering maze of corridors, trying to memorize the layout of this vast, forbidding place that was now her home. Mrs. Davies' sitting room was mercifully smaller and more comfortable than the formal rooms Aveline had seen yesterday. The housekeeper rose from her desk as Aveline entered, her stern expression softening slightly. "Your Grace, I trust you slept well." The polite fiction almost made Aveline smile. She doubted anyone in the servants' hall was unaware of what had transpired between the Duke and his new bride last night. "Well enough, thank you, Mrs. Davies. You wish to discuss household matters?" What followed was a 3-hour immersion into the staggering complexity of managing Wrentham Hall. There were menus to approve for the week, accounts to review, disputes between staff members to adjudicate, and correspondence from tenant families requesting the Duchess's intervention in various matters. The previous Duchess, Damien's mother, had been dead for 10 years, and in her absence, Mrs. Davies had managed admirably. But there were decisions that required the mistress's authority, and a backlog of them had accumulated. Aveline listened, asked questions, and felt increasingly overwhelmed by the sheer scope of responsibility. She had managed her father's modest household, but this was something else entirely. A small kingdom with dozens of people dependent on the decisions she made. "The still room needs restocking," Mrs. Davies continued, consulting her notes. "And there's the matter of the charity baskets for the tenant families. Her late Grace always prepared them personally for the winter months." "Then I shall do the same," Aveline said, making a note in the small book Peters had provided. "What else?" Mrs. Davies' expression warmed fractionally, approval evident in her eyes. "That will be all for this morning, Your Grace. Unless you have questions?" Aveline had 1,000 questions, but most of them had nothing to do with household management. Where was Damien? What were his habits, his preferences, the rhythms of his days? How was she meant to be his Duchess when he was a stranger who shared her bed with passionate intensity, but refused to share anything of himself? "No questions, Mrs. Davies. Thank you." She spent the rest of the morning exploring the hall, trying to make sense of its labyrinthine layout. It was a beautiful house, she discovered, beneath its severe exterior. The library was particularly magnificent. 3 stories of books in a soaring room with stained glass windows that threw colored light across the polished floors. She found herself drawn to it, running her fingers along leather spines, breathing in the scent of old paper and possibility. "You found my sanctuary?" Aveline spun to find Damien standing in the doorway, still in his riding clothes, his dark hair windswept and his boots muddy. He looked more approachable like this, less the remote Duke and more simply a man who had been working hard in cold weather. "I'm sorry," she said automatically. "I didn't mean to intrude." Mrs. Davies didn't mention, "It's your sanctuary now as well." He moved into the room, pulling off his riding gloves. "You're welcome to use the library whenever you wish." "Do you read?" "Yes." She hesitated, then added, "My mother taught me. She believed education was important, even for daughters." Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of interest breaking through his usual reserve. "What do you read?" "History, mostly. Some poetry, though I find most of it too sentimental for my taste." She waited for him to mock her unfeminine preferences, but he simply nodded. "The history collection is on the north wall, 2nd and 3rd shelves. Some of the volumes are quite rare." He paused, seeming to consider something. "If you find anything of interest, you may tell me at dinner. I'm curious about your perspective." It was the most personal thing he had said to her outside the marriage bed, and it warmed something in her chest that she had thought frozen solid. "I will." He turned to leave, then stopped. Mrs. Davies tells me you handled the household matters well this morning. She was impressed by your practical approach. You asked her about me? I ask about everything that concerns my estates. His tone was matter-of-fact, but there was something in his eyes, a keen observation that suggested she herself was now counted among those concerns. You're more capable than I expected. It wasn't a compliment, precisely. More an acknowledgement of fact. But coming from him, it felt significant nonetheless. Over the following days, a pattern emerged. Damien rose before dawn and spent his days managing the vast complexity of his holdings, riding out to tenant farms, meeting with his steward, corresponding with his man of business in London. Aveline immersed herself in household management, discovering that she had an unexpected aptitude for organization and problem-solving. The work was challenging, but deeply satisfying in a way her aimless existence in London had never been. They came together at dinner each evening, formal meals served in the cavernous dining room where they sat at opposite ends of a table that could seat 30. The distance between them was absurd, but Damien seemed to prefer it, as though proximity during daylight hours was something to be avoided. Their conversations were stilted and brief. Reports on estate matters, comments on the weather, nothing of substance. But at night, when he came to her rooms or summoned her to his, the distance evaporated entirely. Their physical connection remained fierce and consuming, a language they both spoke fluently, even as words failed them. In those dark hours, she learned the topography of his body, the places that made his breath catch, the low sounds he made when his control finally broke. And he learned her just as thoroughly, with an attentiveness that would have been tender if it weren't so clearly rooted in the same perfectionism he brought to everything else. He never stayed the entire night, never held her afterward or spoke of what passed between them. And she never asked him to, understanding that this too was part of their contract, passion without intimacy, pleasure without vulnerability. On the 5th morning of her residence at Wrentham Hall, Aveline discovered Damien in his study, surrounded by papers and looking more exhausted than she had yet seen him. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his jaw was rough with stubble, suggesting he had worked through the night. "Is something wrong?" she asked from the doorway, uncertain if she should intrude but unable to simply walk away. He looked up, and for a moment his guard slipped. She saw raw worry in his expression before he smoothed it away. "Estate business. Nothing that concerns you." But she heard the lie in his voice, saw the tension in his shoulders. "Damien, I am your wife, your Duchess. If there are problems with the estate, they do concern me." He studied her for a long moment, some internal debate playing out behind his gray eyes. Finally, he gestured to the papers spread across his desk. "Lord Fenris has filed an additional challenge. He's claiming that the marriage was contracted under duress, that your father's debts created a coercive situation that invalidates your consent." Aveline felt cold fury wash through her. "That's absurd," I agreed freely. "Can you prove it?" His voice was flat, lawyer-like. "Your father owed £17,000. I paid his debts the day after you accepted my proposal. Fenris will argue that you had no real choice, that the entire arrangement was predatory on my part." She moved into the room, her mind racing through the implications. "What does your solicitor say?" "That we need to demonstrate the marriage is genuine. Not merely a legal convenience, but a real partnership." He leaned back in his chair, frustration evident in every line of his body. "Which it is not, as we both know." The blunt acknowledgement stung more than it should have. "So what do we do?" "We play the part. When we return to London for the hearing, we must appear as a devoted couple. Attend social events together. Demonstrate affection publicly. The word affection sounded foreign in his mouth, as though he were speaking a language he didn't know. Can you manage that? She thought of Lady Clarissa, of Lord Rothwell, of all the people who had watched her humiliation and whispered behind their fans about the rejected maiden. And she thought of returning to London on Damien's arm, transformed and powerful, no longer a victim, but a duchess. Yes, she said firmly, I can manage that. He nodded, some of the tension easing from his expression. Good. We leave for London in 2 weeks. The storm arrived on the 10th day of Aveline's residence at Wrentham Hall, sweeping in from the north with sheets of freezing rain that battered the ancient windows and turned the moorland into a gray, desolate landscape. Damien had ridden out early that morning to inspect damage to one of the tenant cottages and had not yet returned by late afternoon. Aveline found herself pacing the library, glancing toward the windows with growing unease as the light faded and the storm intensified. She had no right to worry about him, she reminded herself. Their arrangement did not include concern for each other's welfare beyond what duty demanded. And yet the thought of him out in this weather, alone on the treacherous moor roads, created a tight knot of anxiety in her chest that would not be reasoned away. To distract herself, she began exploring the library more systematically, working her way along the shelves in search of the history volumes Damien had mentioned. On the third tier, accessible only by the rolling ladder, she found a section that was clearly more personal than the rest. Books with cracked spines and marginalia in familiar masculine handwriting, volumes of poetry alongside treatises on agriculture and horse breeding. One book was shelved backward, its spine facing the wall. Curious, Aveline pulled it out and found herself holding not a book at all, but a leather portfolio tied with a faded ribbon. She knew she shouldn't open it, knew that whatever lay inside was private, perhaps deliberately hidden. But her fingers were already working at the knot, driven by a need to understand the man who shared her bed but remained a stranger in every other regard. Inside were letters, dozens of them, written in an elegant feminine hand and addressed to "My dearest Damien." Aveline's conscience warred with her curiosity for perhaps 3 seconds before curiosity won. She carried the portfolio to one of the leather chairs near the fire and began to read. The letters chronicled a courtship, tender declarations of affection from a woman named Catherine Alderidge, promises of devotion and partnership, discussions of their future life together. The tone was warm and intimate, the writer clearly intelligent and well-educated. Aveline could see how Damien might have been drawn to her, might have believed they had built something genuine. Then the tone shifted. The later letters became more calculated, asking pointed questions about Damien's business dealings, his shipping contracts, his relationships with various merchants. The requests were subtle, couched in wifely interest and admiration. But once Aveline knew to look for them, they were unmistakable. The final letter was different, written in Damien's hand, never sent. The words were brutal in their controlled fury. "Catherine, I know what you are. I know who sent you and what you have taken from me. You played your part with remarkable skill, I will grant you that. I genuinely believed you cared for something beyond the intelligence you were gathering. That delusion cost me £30,000 and nearly cost me the Wrentham shipping contracts. It also cost me something far more valuable, the capacity to trust another human being. I hope whoever paid you thought it worth the price. I am only sorry I did not see through you sooner." Aveline's hands trembled as she set the letter down. The casual cruelty of such a betrayal, the calculated seduction designed solely to extract information, no wonder he had built walls around himself. No wonder he insisted on contracts and clarity, on arrangements devoid of sentiment. That portfolio was not meant to be found. She startled violently, nearly dropping the letters. Damien stood in the library doorway, soaked through from the rain, his dark hair plastered to his skull and water pooling on the floor around his boots. His expression was utterly unreadable, but his eyes were fixed on the papers in her hands with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I'm sorry," she said immediately, rising to her feet. "I was looking for the history books you mentioned, and I found this. And I shouldn't have. I had no right to." "No, you didn't." He moved into the room, leaving wet footprints on the ancient carpet. "But you did anyway." She set the portfolio down on the table between them, like a peace offering. "I wanted to understand. You're my husband, and yet you're a complete stranger to me. I thought perhaps if I knew what had made you so—" "Cold," he supplied, his voice dangerously soft. "Incapable of the tender emotions you were no doubt raised to expect from marriage?" "Guarded," she corrected, meeting his gaze steadily. "I was going to say guarded, and not without reason, clearly." He stared at her for a long moment, some violent emotion working beneath his controlled exterior. Then he turned away, moving to the decanter of brandy on the sideboard and pouring himself a generous measure. He drank it in one swallow, his back to her, the wet fabric of his coat clinging to the powerful lines of his shoulders. "Catherine Aldridge was placed in my path 5 years ago by Marcus Fenris," he said finally, his voice flat and emotionless. "She was his cousin, beautiful and accomplished, and possessed of exactly the qualities I had told friends I valued in a potential wife. Our introduction seemed natural, organic. She was clever enough to let me pursue her, to make me feel as though I had discovered her rather than the reverse." Aveline remained silent, sensing he needed to tell this in his own way. "We courted for 8 months. I proposed. She accepted. I believed we had built something real, a partnership based on mutual respect and compatible temperaments." He poured another brandy but didn't drink it, just stared down into the amber liquid. 3 weeks before the wedding, my man of business discovered that information about a critical shipping contract had been leaked to my primary competitor. When we traced the source, it led back to Catherine. She had been systematically gathering intelligence throughout our entire courtship and feeding it to Fenris, who was using it to undercut my business dealings. Damien. When I confronted her, she didn't even bother to deny it. She simply smiled and told me I had been easier to manipulate than she'd expected, that my belief in her affection had made me careless. He finally turned to face her, and the bleakness in his eyes made her chest ache. She was right. I was a fool, and it cost me dearly. Aveline moved toward him slowly, as one might approach a wounded animal. "You weren't a fool. You were betrayed by someone you trusted. That's not the same thing." "Isn't it?" He set down the untouched brandy with careful precision. "I allowed sentiment to compromise my judgment. I convinced myself that Catherine's interest in my business affairs was natural wifely curiosity rather than espionage. I ignored warning signs because I wanted to believe in something that wasn't real." "So you decided never to believe in anything again," Aveline said softly. "Never to let anyone close enough to hurt you. To reduce all relationships to contractual arrangements where everyone's motives are clear and nothing can surprise you." His jaw tightened. "It's a rational response to experience. It's a prison." The words came out more forcefully than she intended, but she didn't take them back. "You've locked yourself away so completely that you can't see the difference between calculated deception and genuine connection. There is no difference, he said coldly. Everyone wants something, Aveline. At least in a contract, the terms are explicit. You wanted security for your family. I wanted a wife to secure the Thornwood claim. Neither of us is deceiving the other about our motives. No, she agreed. But neither are we giving each other anything beyond what the contract demands. Is that really how you want to live? In a marriage devoid of everything but duty and physical release? His eyes flashed with something dangerous. Be very careful, Duchess. You're beginning to sound like a woman who wants to renegotiate our arrangement. I'm not asking you to love me, she said, though the words cost her more than she wanted to admit. I'm asking if you can even imagine trusting me enough to be friends. To share more than a bed and a title. To actually talk to each other about things that matter. Why? The question was harsh, almost accusatory. What possible benefit does that serve? Because we're married, she said simply. For better or worse, for the rest of our lives. And I would rather spend those years with a partner than a stranger who happens to share my name. He stared at her, and she saw the conflict in his expression. The part of him that wanted to accept what she offered, warring with the part that had learned never to lower his guard. Finally, he shook his head. I can't give you what you're asking for, Aveline. The capacity for that kind of openness died with my trust in Catherine. All I have left is honesty about my limitations. If that's not enough? It's a start, she interrupted. Honesty is more than most marriages have. He looked surprised, as though he'd expected her to push harder or retreat in wounded silence. You're a strange woman, Aveline Hartwell. Strange enough to marry you, she replied, and was rewarded with the barest twitch of his lips that might, in another man, have been the beginning of a smile. The tension between them eased fractionally, the storm outside providing a counterpoint to the charged silence within. Damien retrieved his brandy and finally drank it, some of the rigid control leaving his shoulders. There's a ruin on the eastern edge of the estate, he said abruptly, the remains of a Norman chapel. My mother wanted to restore it before she died, but my father refused to allocate the funds. I've been considering taking on the project, but I don't have her eye for historical detail. If you're interested in history, perhaps you could review the architect's plans. Give me your perspective. It was an offering, Aveline realized. A small opening in his carefully constructed walls, an invitation to share something beyond their contractual obligations. Her heart beat faster. I would like that very much, she said quietly. He nodded once, then turned toward the door. I should change out of these wet clothes before I catch my death. Damien? He paused, glancing back at her. Thank you for telling me about Catherine, for trusting me with that much at least. Something unreadable flickered across his face. Don't make me regret it, Aveline. Then he was gone, leaving her alone with the letters and the fading fire and the first fragile thread of connection between them. The gentleman arrived on a gray afternoon 2 days after the storm, announced by Peters with the formal precision reserved for visitors of quality. Mr. Cornelius Whitmore, to see Her Grace. He claims to represent a historical society interested in the chapel restoration. Aveline looked up from the architect's plans she had been studying in the morning room, surprised and slightly pleased. Damien had given her the portfolio only yesterday, and she had already become absorbed in the project. A chance to restore something beautiful from ruin felt oddly symbolic of her own transformation. Perhaps this Mr. Whitmore could provide useful insight. Show him in, please, Peters. The man who entered was perhaps 50, well-dressed in a coat of excellent quality, with sharp features and pale eyes that assessed the room with practiced efficiency before settling on Aveline. His smile was pleasant enough, but something about it made her uneasy, a calculation behind the courtesy. "Your Grace, how kind of you to receive me." He bowed with perfect correctness. "I apologize for calling without prior appointment, but I happened to be traveling through the area and heard of the Duke's plans for the Norman Chapel. My society has undertaken similar restorations, and I thought perhaps I might offer some expertise." "That's very generous, Mr. Whitmore. Please sit." Aveline gestured to the chair across from her, her instincts prickling with warning even as her manners demanded hospitality. "Would you care for tea?" "Most kind." He settled into the chair with the ease of a man accustomed to fine houses. "I must say, Your Grace, the transformation in your circumstances has been quite remarkable. One season, you're the talk of London for all the wrong reasons, and the next, you're Duchess of Wrentham. Quite the reversal of fortune." The shift in conversation was jarring, but Aveline kept her expression neutral. "Fortune has indeed been kind." "Has it?" His smile widened slightly, taking on an edge. Or perhaps it was simply necessity. "I understand your father's debts were quite substantial before your marriage. £17,000, wasn't it? A crushing burden for a family of modest means." Ice settled in Aveline's stomach. This was no representative of a historical society. "Mr. Whitmore, if you have business with my husband, I suggest you direct your inquiries to him. The matter of my dowry and settlements are not appropriate topics for discussion." Of course, forgive me." He didn't look remotely apologetic. "I only mention it because there are those who question whether the marriage was entirely voluntary on your part. A young woman in desperate circumstances, approached by a powerful duke with the means to solve all her problems. One might argue that constitutes a form of coercion." "One might argue many things," Aveline said coldly, understanding now exactly who had sent this man and why. "That doesn't make them true." "Ah, but truth is so often a matter of perspective, isn't it?" Whitmore leaned forward slightly, his pale eyes fixed on her face with predatory interest. "Take, for instance, the matter of Viscount Rothwell. The truth is he publicly rejected you at the Pemberton Ball 2 years ago, announced his engagement to another woman while you stood there humiliated before half of London's society. That's documented fact. But the perspective one takes on that truth, whether you were a victim of cruel treatment or somehow complicit in your own disgrace, that's where interpretation comes in." Aveline's hands clenched in her lap, her nails digging into her palms. "I think you should leave, Mr. Whitmore." "In a moment, Your Grace. I simply want to ensure you understand your position. There will be a hearing in London regarding the Thornwood estates. Questions will be raised about the circumstances of your marriage, about whether a woman in your particular situation, publicly rejected, financially desperate, socially compromised, could truly give free consent to a union proposed by a man who held all the power in the arrangement." He pulled a card from his pocket and placed it on the table between them. "My employer, Lord Fenris, wishes you to know that if you were to testify that you felt pressured into this marriage, that the Duke took advantage of your vulnerable state, certain accommodations could be made. Your family would be protected, financially. You would be free to seek an annulment and make a more suitable match." "Your employer," Aveline said, her voice shaking with barely controlled fury, "is asking me to commit perjury and betray my husband. My employer is offering you an escape from a situation you were coerced into accepting." Whitmore stood, his expression one of false sympathy. "Think about it, Your Grace. You owe the Duke nothing but what he purchased with his wealth and title. If you chose to tell the truth about the circumstances of your marriage, the truth, a new voice cut through the room like a blade. Please, do enlighten us about this truth you're peddling. Aveline's heart leapt into her throat. Damien stood in the doorway, his presence filling the space with cold, controlled fury. He must have been in the adjacent study, must have heard every word of Whitmore's vile insinuations. His face was a mask of ice, but his eyes burned with something dangerous and barely leashed. Whitmore paled visibly, but held his ground. Your Grace, you were merely attempting to manipulate my wife into providing false testimony to support Fenris's spurious legal claim. Damien moved into the room with predatory grace, each step deliberate and measured. Did you truly think I wouldn't have this house watched? That I wouldn't know the moment one of Fenris's creatures darkened my doorway? I represent a legitimate historical society. You represent Marcus Fenris, and you came here to threaten and intimidate the Duchess of Rentham. Damien's voice dropped to something lethal. You made a grave mistake, Whitmore. The agent's composure cracked slightly. I made no threats. I simply offered Her Grace an alternative perspective on her situation. You questioned her honor, Damien said, and there was steel beneath the silk of his tone. You suggested she was a woman of such little character that she could be bought into betraying her marriage vows. You referenced a past humiliation inflicted upon her by a worthless boy with more pride than sense, as though that somehow reflected poorly on her rather than on the villain who perpetrated it. He had reached Whitmore now, standing close enough to tower over the shorter man. The agent took an involuntary step backward. Let me offer you a truth, Whitmore, one you can take back to your master. Damien's voice was soft and deadly. My wife is a woman of extraordinary courage and integrity. She has endured cruelties that would have broken lesser people and emerged with her dignity intact. She accepted my proposal freely, as an equal partner entering into a mutually beneficial arrangement. The fact that I had the means to solve her family's financial difficulties does not make her acceptance coerced any more than her acceptance makes my proposal predatory. Aveline sat frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs as she listened to Damien defend her with a ferocity she had never imagined he possessed. Furthermore, Damien continued, if I ever hear that you, or Fenris, or anyone connected to this contemptible scheme has so much as mentioned my wife's name in anything other than respectful terms, I will destroy you. Not quickly, not mercifully, but with the full weight of every resource at my disposal. I will ruin your employer's reputation, strip away his assets piece by piece, and ensure that the Fenris name becomes synonymous with dishonor and desperation. Do I make myself clear? Whitmore had gone white. Your Grace, I assure you, get out. The command cracked like a whip. Get out of my house, off my lands, and out of my county. If I see you again, I will have you thrown in jail for trespassing and counted a mercy. The agent fled, stumbling slightly in his haste to reach the door. His footsteps echoed rapidly down the corridor, and moments later the sound of the front door slamming reverberated through the house. Silence fell over the morning room. Damien stood with his back to Aveline, his shoulders rigid with tension, his hands clenched at his sides. She could see the rapid rise and fall of his breathing, the barely controlled fury still coursing through him. Damien, she said softly. He turned to face her, and the expression in his eyes stole her breath. Not cold now, not remote, but burning with an intensity that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with something far more complex. Did he hurt you? The question was rough, almost harsh. Did anything he said? No, She rose from her chair, her legs unsteady. You stopped him before, but even if you hadn't, his words couldn't hurt me. Not anymore. They were meant to. Damien's jaw tightened. Fenris sent him here deliberately, knowing I would be occupied with the steward. He wanted to catch you alone, to undermine your confidence, to make you doubt yourself and our marriage. I know. Aveline moved closer to him, drawn by something she couldn't name. But what you said, the way you defended me, was nothing more than the truth. He reached out suddenly, his hand cupping her face with surprising gentleness. You are not a woman who can be bought or coerced, Aveline. You're stronger than Fenris could possibly comprehend. Stronger than I gave you credit for when I first proposed this arrangement. His thumb brushed across her cheekbone, and she felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. You didn't have to say those things. The contract doesn't require you to. Damn the contract. The words came out fierce and low. That snake questioned your honor, suggested you were complicit in your own humiliation, implied you were desperate enough to betray your vows for money. I would have defended you if we'd been married 10 minutes or 10 years. Something cracked open in Aveline's chest, a flood of emotion too powerful to contain. Without thinking, she closed the distance between them and wrapped her arms around him, pressing her face against his chest. He stiffened for a moment, clearly surprised by the embrace. But then his arms came around her, holding her with careful strength. Thank you, she whispered against the fine wool of his coat. Not for the defense, though that was, thank you for seeing me. For understanding that I'm not weak just because I've been hurt. His hand moved to the back of her head, his fingers tangling gently in her hair. You're the furthest thing from weak, Aveline. I've known that since the night you accepted my proposal. A weak woman would have crumbled under the weight of what I offered. You negotiated terms. She pulled back slightly to look up at him, surprised to find his expression had softened. The ice melted into something warmer and infinitely more dangerous to her carefully guarded heart. I'm beginning to think, she said carefully, that this arrangement of ours is becoming something more complicated than we intended. His thumb traced the line of her jaw. Perhaps it is. Does that concern you? Yes, he admitted, but not enough to stop it. My lovely family, can we just talk about what Damien did here? This is the moment everything changes between them. And if this scene gave you butterflies, if you're rooting for these two, as hard as I am, but you scrolled past the like button, that actually hurts. More than Rothwell's rejection hurt Aveline. I spend hours crafting these stories, finding the perfect narrative flow, writing every emotion so you feel it. The like button takes 1 second. One tap shows YouTube this story matters, and it pushes this video to others who desperately need this escape today. Don't be the person who takes the story, but gives nothing back. Show some love. Subscribe. Let's continue. The shift between them after Whitmore's expulsion was subtle but unmistakable. Damien no longer retreated to his study immediately after breakfast, no longer spent every waking hour managing estate business in self-imposed isolation. Instead, he began seeking Aveline out, asking her opinion on tenant disputes, inviting her to ride with him across the estate, lingering over dinner in a way that suggested he was in no hurry for the meal to end. And at night, when he came to her rooms or drew her into his, the fierce passion that had always existed between them took on a different quality. He touched her with the same intensity, but now there was something else woven through it. A tenderness in the way his fingers traced the curve of her spine, a reverence in how he whispered her name against her skin. Afterward, he no longer retreated immediately to his own chambers. Sometimes he stayed for an hour, their bodies still tangled together, his hand absently stroking her hair while they talked in low voices about nothing and everything. Aveline felt herself falling, tumbling headlong into emotions she had promised herself she wouldn't develop. She was falling in love with her husband, and the knowledge terrified her. On a crisp morning 10 days after Whitmore's visit, Damien appeared in the breakfast room with an unusual request. "I need your perspective on something. Will you join me in my study?" His private study was a room Aveline had never entered. His sanctuary, the place where he conducted the serious business of managing one of England's largest estates. To be invited inside felt significant, like crossing an invisible threshold into territory previously forbidden. The room was exactly what she would have expected. Dark wood paneling, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a massive desk covered in correspondence and ledgers. But there were also unexpected touches. A collection of geological specimens on one shelf. A faded watercolor of the moors hanging beside the window. Evidence of interests beyond mere business. Damien gestured to a chair beside his desk. "Sit. I want you to read something." He handed her a letter written in an elderly hand, the script shaky but legible. It was from the widow of one of his tenant farmers, requesting permission to remain in her cottage despite being unable to pay rent since her husband's death 6 months prior. She had 3 young children and nowhere else to go. "What would you do?" Damien asked, watching her face as she read. Aveline looked up, surprised by the question. "You're asking my opinion?" "I'm asking what you would do if this decision were yours to make." She considered carefully, aware that this was some kind of test, though she wasn't certain of what. "I would forgive the back rent and allow her to remain in the cottage. But I would also find her employment, perhaps in the household or helping with the dairy. She needs more than charity. She needs a way to support her family with dignity." Damien's expression remained unreadable. "That's precisely what I was thinking. But my steward advises against it. He says it sets a dangerous precedent that other tenants will expect similar leniency." "Your steward is thinking only of immediate revenue," Aveline said, her confidence growing. "But you're thinking of long-term stability. A family turned out becomes the parish's problem, or worse, they turn to crime out of desperation. A family given the means to support itself becomes productive and loyal. It's not charity, it's investment." Something shifted in his expression, approval, or perhaps relief. "Read the next one." What followed was an extraordinary 2 hours in which Damien presented her with a series of estate matters requiring decisions. A dispute between 2 tenant families over boundary lines. A request from the village for funds to repair the church roof. A proposal from his man of business regarding new agricultural techniques. Each time, he asked for her perspective, listened intently to her reasoning, and then shared his own thoughts. Sometimes they agreed. Sometimes they debated, their discussions growing animated as they challenged each other's assumptions. Aveline found herself exhilarated by it, by the respect implicit in his questions, by the way he treated her intelligence as an asset rather than an inconvenience. This was partnership of a kind she had never imagined. Not romantic declarations and tender gestures, but the profound intimacy of shared purpose and mutual respect. "You have good instincts," Damien said finally, leaning back in his chair and regarding her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "Better than my steward's, in some cases. He thinks only in terms of profit and precedent. You think in terms of people." "I grew up watching my father make poor decisions," Aveline said quietly. "I learned what not to do. Still, most women of your station wouldn't care about tenant disputes or agricultural investments." They would consider such matters beneath them. The Duke's concern, but not the Duchess's. I'm not most women. She met his gaze steadily. And this is my home now, too. These people depend on us. How could I not care? He stood abruptly, moving to the window that overlooked the moorland. The morning light carved sharp shadows across his profile, emphasizing the strong line of his jaw, the tension in his shoulders. When he spoke, his voice was low and carefully controlled. I didn't expect this. Expect what? You. He turned to face her, and the vulnerability in his expression made her breath catch. When I proposed this arrangement, I thought I was acquiring a solution to a legal problem. A wife who would fulfill the necessary role without demanding anything I couldn't give. I thought it would be simple, transactional, manageable. Aveline rose from her chair, her heart beating too fast. And it's not? No. The word came out rough, almost harsh. It's not. You've made yourself necessary in ways I never anticipated. I find myself seeking your counsel on matters I would normally decide alone. I find myself wanting to tell you about my day, wanting to hear your thoughts on things that have nothing to do with our arrangement. I find myself, he stopped, jaw tightening as though he was fighting against the words. I find myself needing you, Aveline, and I don't know what to do with that. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and honest and terrifying in its implications. Aveline wanted to cross the room, wanted to tell him that she felt the same, that she had fallen in love with him, despite all her careful intentions to keep her heart protected. But fear held her frozen. If she told him she loved him, would he retreat? Would he see it as proof that women couldn't maintain emotional distance? That sentiment inevitably complicated practical arrangements? Would he rebuild the walls between them, afraid that her feelings would lead to the kind of manipulative behavior Catherine had demonstrated? Damien, she said carefully, what we have, this partnership we've built, it's more than either of us expected. That doesn't have to be a problem. Doesn't it? He moved toward her, his eyes searching her face. I promised you a contractual marriage. Duty without demands. But what I feel when I look at you now, he reached out, his hand cupping her face with heartbreaking gentleness. This is not what the contract stipulated. Perhaps the contract was incomplete, she whispered, leaning into his touch, even as her heart hammered with fear and hope in equal measure. Perhaps we didn't know enough about what we needed when we made it. His thumb traced her lower lip, his gaze intense and conflicted. I swore I would never let myself need anyone again. That kind of dependency, that vulnerability, it's dangerous. It gives people power to hurt you. Yes, Aveline agreed softly. It does. But it also gives them the power to help you, to strengthen you, to share the burdens you've been carrying alone. And if I let myself need you, he said, his voice dropping to something raw and unguarded, and you discover that need gives you power over me, what then? How do I trust that you won't use it the way Catherine did? The question broke her heart because she understood the fear behind it, the wound that still hadn't fully healed. She reached up, covering his hand with hers, holding his touch against her face. I can't prove it with words, she said. I can only prove it with time, with choices, with the way I stand beside you rather than using you. But Damien, you have to be willing to take the risk. You have to be willing to believe that not every woman is Catherine. That I might actually be exactly what I appear to be. He stared at her for a long moment, conflict warring in his expression. Then he pulled her against him, his arms wrapping around her with almost desperate strength, his face buried in her hair. "I'm trying," he whispered against her temple. "God help me, Aveline. I'm trying." She held him just as tightly, her eyes burning with unshed tears, the words, "I love you," trapped behind her teeth. She wanted to say them, wanted to offer him that truth. But the timing felt wrong. Too soon, too much pressure on foundations still settling. He had confessed he needed her. For now, perhaps that was enough. For now, she would hold him and let him feel her steadiness, her reliability, her absolute commitment to this partnership they were building. And she would hope that someday soon, he would be ready to hear what her heart was screaming. That she loved him. Not for his title or his wealth or the security he provided, but for the complicated, wounded, extraordinary man beneath all of it. "We should prepare for London," Damien said finally, his voice rough with emotion he was clearly struggling to contain. "The hearing is in 1 week. Fenris will do everything in his power to discredit our marriage." "Then we'll show him a united front," Aveline said firmly, pulling back to look up at him. "We'll show all of them that this marriage is real, that we're partners in every sense." His hand came up to cup her face again, his gray eyes searching hers. "And we are, aren't we? Partners?" "Yes," she said, pouring every ounce of conviction she possessed into the word. "We are." He kissed her then, soft and lingering, a kiss that felt like a promise neither of them was quite ready to speak aloud. And Aveline let herself believe that perhaps, just perhaps, their contractual arrangement was transforming into something neither of them had dared to hope for, something real. The summons arrived 3 days before they were scheduled to depart for London. Damien's solicitor, Mr. Pembroke, made the journey from the city himself, rather than trusting such news to a courier. Never a good sign. Aveline watched from the morning room window as the travel-worn lawyer was shown into Damien's study, his expression grave. She tried to focus on the household accounts spread before her, but her attention kept drifting to the closed study door, to the low murmur of male voices occasionally rising in what sounded like heated discussion. 2 hours passed before Damien finally emerged, his face a mask of cold fury that made her stomach drop. "What's happened?" she asked, rising from her seat. "Fenris has filed an amended petition with the magistrate." His voice was clipped, controlled, but she could hear the rage simmering beneath. "He's no longer merely challenging the deed on technical grounds. He's now arguing that my marriage itself is fraudulent, a sham arrangement contracted under duress to circumvent the legal requirements." Aveline felt the blood drain from her face. "On what basis?" "On the basis of your past." Damien moved to the sideboard and poured himself a whiskey despite the early hour. "He's compiled a dossier of witness statements from the Pemberton Ball 2 years ago, detailing Rothwell's public rejection of you. He has statements from your father's creditors documenting the extent of his debts. He's even obtained testimony from servants at Ashford House describing your desperate attempts to secure Mr. Waverley's proposal the night we met." Each word landed like a blow. Aveline sank back into her chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her. "He's painting me as a fortune hunter who trapped you. He's painting you as an unstable, desperate woman who would do anything to escape her circumstances, and me as a fool who was manipulated into a hasty marriage by a scheming family." Damien downed the whiskey in one swallow. "He's arguing that no woman in your position could give genuine consent to such an arrangement, that the marriage should be annulled as contractually invalid due to coercion on your side and gross negligence on mine." "But that's insane. I agreed freely. Did you?" He turned to face her, and the bleakness in his expression made her chest ache. That's the question the magistrate will ask. You were facing financial ruin, social ostracism, and the complete destruction of your family's prospects. I appeared with an offer that solved all those problems in exchange for your agreement to marry me. Fenris will argue that no reasonable person could call that free choice. Aveline's hands trembled in her lap. What does Mr. Pembroke advise? He advises that we prepare for a protracted legal battle that will drag every detail of your past and our courtship through public scrutiny. He advises that we gather character witnesses, that we demonstrate the marriage is genuine and not merely a legal convenience. Damien's jaw tightened. He also advises that our chances are not good. The magistrate handling the case is Lord Aldridge, who sits on several committees with Fenris. The fix, as they say, may already be in. The room seemed to tilt around Aveline. This was her fault. Her scandalous past, her desperate circumstances, her very existence had given Fenris the ammunition he needed to destroy everything Damien had worked to protect. The Thornwood estates, 2,000 acres, and the income they generated, all at risk because Damien had made the mistake of claiming her. There's something else, Damien said quietly. Fenris has let it be known through back channels that if I were to agree to an annulment and marry someone from an approved list of candidates, all women with connections to his political faction, he would withdraw his challenge to the deeds. Aveline's head snapped up. He wants you to set me aside. He wants to demonstrate that I can be controlled, that marriage to the right woman would bring me into his sphere of influence. Damien's voice was flat, emotionless. He's using you as leverage. The pieces fell into place with horrifying clarity. Fenris had never really believed he could win the legal challenge on its merits. This had always been about forcing Damien into a marriage alliance, about bringing the powerful Duke of Rentham under Fenris's control through the bonds of kinship and obligation. Aveline was simply the tool he had chosen to apply pressure, the weak point in Damien's armor. She stood abruptly, her mind made up with crystalline certainty. Then we give him what he wants. Damien's expression went very still. What? We agree to the annulment. The words tore at her heart, but she forced them out with steady conviction. You marry someone from his list, secure the Thornwood estates, and I return to my family with the settlement you've already provided. They're safe now, financially. I've done what I needed to do. Absolutely not. The words came out hard and sharp as a whip crack. Damien, be reasonable. I am being reasonable. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, gripping her shoulders with barely controlled intensity. You're the one proposing something insane. I'm proposing the practical solution. Aveline's voice rose despite her best efforts to maintain composure. I'm the liability here. My past, my scandal, my desperate circumstances, I'm the weapon Fenris is using against you. Remove me from the equation, and you remove his leverage. And give him exactly what he wants? Prove that I can be manipulated into abandoning my wife the moment the cost becomes inconvenient? Damien's eyes blazed with fury. I would rather lose every acre of Thornwood than validate his tactics. This isn't about tactics, it's about reality. She pulled away from his grip, her own anger rising to meet his. I'm ruining you, Damien. Everything I touch turns to scandal and shame. Rothwell, my father's debts, and now this? I destroy everything and everyone who makes the mistake of associating with me. That's not true. It is true. The words burst out of her, raw and anguished. I'm poison, don't you see? I thought perhaps here, at Rentham, I could be different. I thought perhaps I could be useful, could be the partner you needed. But I was fooling myself. I'm still the rejected maiden, still the desperate woman who brings nothing but trouble to those around her. Understanding dawned in Damien's expression, his anger transforming into something more complex. Evelyn, let me go. She was crying now, tears streaming down her face despite her efforts to maintain dignity. Please, Damien, let me leave before I cost you everything that matters. You can tell society I was unsuitable, that you discovered my character wanting. No one will blame you for setting aside a woman like me. A woman like you. He repeated the words softly, something dangerous in his tone. And what kind of woman is that, precisely? Damaged, worthless. The kind of woman who gets publicly rejected because she's not good enough, who has to sell herself into a contractual marriage because no one would want her otherwise. Stop! The command cracked through the room. Damien closed the distance between them, his hands framing her face with unexpected gentleness. Stop saying those things about yourself. They're true. They're lies you've been told so many times, you've started to believe them. His thumbs brushed away her tears with heartbreaking tenderness. Listen to me, Aveline. That panic in your eyes right now, that certainty that you're worthless and destructive, that's not reality. That's the wound that Rothwell and society and your own difficult circumstances inflicted on you. But it's not the truth. You don't understand. I understand perfectly. His voice softened, taking on a quality she'd never heard before. I understand that you're terrified of being the reason someone else suffers. I understand that you would rather sacrifice yourself than watch me lose something I value. But Aveline, what you don't seem to grasp is that you're not the liability here. You're the asset. She stared at him through her tears, unable to process what he was saying. Did you think I didn't notice? Damien continued, his gray eyes intense and utterly focused on her face. The way you've transformed the household management, the insight you bring to estate decisions, the way the tenants have started coming to you with problems because they trust your judgment. Did you think I didn't see how you've made Rentham feel like a home instead of a mausoleum? I was just doing my duty. You were being exactly who you are. Competent, compassionate, intelligent, strong. His hands tightened fractionally on her face. And if you think I'm going to let Fenris or anyone else drive you away because they've convinced you that you're not worthy of being my Duchess, you're very much mistaken. But the estates, damn the estates. The words were fierce, absolute. I've lost property before and regained it. I've fought legal battles and won. But Aveline, if I let you go now, if I let you walk away, believing that you're the problem rather than the solution, I lose something irreplaceable. Her breath caught. What? You. The word hung between them, weighted with meaning he wasn't quite ready to fully articulate. I lose you. And I find that prospect far more devastating than losing 2,000 acres to Marcus Fenris. Damien. Her voice broke on his name. I'm not giving you up. His forehead rested against hers, his voice dropping to something raw and unguarded. I'm not sending you away. To protect me from consequences I willingly accepted when I proposed this marriage. We face this together, Aveline. We fight Fenris together. And if we lose together. But I will not abandon you to save myself. Something broke open in Aveline's chest, a flood of emotion so powerful it threatened to drown her. He was choosing her. Not the estates, not the practical solution. not the path of least resistance. Her. "I'm afraid," she whispered. "I'm afraid of failing you." "Then we'll fail together." He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. "But I don't think we will. I think we're going to walk into that hearing, show them a united front, and prove that our marriage is exactly what it appears to be. A genuine partnership built on mutual respect and trust." "Is that what it is?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. His expression softened into something that made her heart ache. "Yes, and possibly more than that, though I'm still trying to understand exactly what we've become." She knew what they'd become, at least for her. She loved him, completely, irrevocably, with a depth that terrified her. But standing here with his hands on her face and his eyes burning with determination to keep her, she didn't need to say it. Not yet. "We leave for London tomorrow," he said. "And we show Fenris what a mistake he made by underestimating us both." London in late autumn was a different creature than the glittering spectacle of the season. The air held a chill that no amount of coal fires could quite dispel, and the streets were quieter, populated by those whose business or obligations kept them in the city rather than those seeking entertainment. Damien and Aveline arrived at Wrentham House 3 days before the scheduled hearing, and immediately the invitations began arriving. Subtle summons from members of society eager to assess the Duke's controversial marriage firsthand. The most significant came on their second evening in residence, delivered by liveried footmen on heavy cream stationery. Lord Marcus Fenris requested the honor of the Duke and Duchess of Wrentham's presence at a dinner party to be held the night before the hearing. The invitation was ostensibly a gesture of goodwill, an opportunity for the two parties to demonstrate civility before their legal dispute. In reality, it was a gauntlet thrown down, a challenge that could not be refused without appearing weak. "He wants an audience," Damien said, studying the invitation with cold eyes. "He wants society to witness whatever humiliation he has planned." Aveline looked up from her correspondence, her stomach tight with apprehension. "Then we don't attend. We send our regrets and confirm that we're afraid of him? That our marriage can't withstand public scrutiny?" Damien set the invitation down with deliberate care. "No. We attend. We show them exactly what we are." "Which is what, precisely?" Aveline tried to keep her voice steady, but fear leaked through despite her best efforts. He crossed to where she sat, tilting her chin up with gentle fingers. "A partnership. A genuine union that can't be shaken by Fenris's machinations or society's judgment." His thumb brushed across her lower lip. "Trust me, Aveline. I won't let him hurt you." She wanted to believe him. But as their carriage drew up to Fenris's imposing townhouse 2 nights later, every instinct screamed at her to flee. The windows blazed with light, and she could see silhouettes of guests moving inside. The cream of London society gathered to witness whatever spectacle their host had arranged. Damien's hand found hers in the darkness of the carriage, his grip strong and steady. "Remember what we discussed. You are the Duchess of Wrentham. You bow to no one but royalty, and you certainly don't cower before Marcus Fenris." "I'm not cowering," she lied, her palm damp against his. "You're terrified." His voice softened fractionally. "I can feel you trembling." But Aveline, fear and courage aren't opposites. Courage is being afraid and doing the thing anyway. The footman opened the door, and there was no more time for reassurance. Damien descended first, then turned to hand her down, his expression transforming into the cold, remote mask he wore for society. But his hand remained locked with hers, a private anchor in the public performance. Lord Fenris greeted them in the entrance hall with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He was perhaps 45, handsome in a polished way, with silver threading through his dark hair and the easy confidence of inherited wealth and position. "Your Graces, what an honor. I'm delighted you could join us." "Lord Fenris." Damien's acknowledgement was barely civil. "I trust this evening will be more pleasant than our legal proceedings have been." "Oh, I certainly hope so." Fenris's gaze slid to Aveline, assessing her with predatory interest. "Your Grace, you are even lovelier than the gossip suggested. Such a transformation from the unfortunate girl I heard about at the Pemberton ball." "What was it they called you? The rejected maiden?" Aveline felt the blood drain from her face, but before she could respond, Damien's hand tightened warningly on hers. "My wife's past is of no concern to anyone but us," Damien said, his voice dangerously soft. "I suggest we move past such tedious topics." Of course. Fenris gestured toward the drawing room. "The other guests are eager to meet the new Duchess." The evening that followed was exquisitely torturous. Fenris had assembled a carefully curated guest list, people who had witnessed Aveline's humiliation 2 years ago, families with eligible daughters who had been passed over when Damien made his shocking choice, and enough influential peers to ensure that whatever happened tonight would be reported throughout London by morning. Aveline endured it with rigid composure, responding to barely veiled insults with polite deflection, ignoring the whispers that followed in her wake. Damien remained at her side like a dark sentinel, his presence a silent warning that kept the worst of the vultures at bay. Then, halfway through dinner, Fenris rose to offer a toast. "To old friends and new alliances," he began, his voice carrying easily through the dining room, "and to the fascinating turns that life can take. Why, I was just thinking earlier about the unpredictability of fortune. Take our dear Duchess, for example. 2 years ago, who could have imagined such a reversal of circumstance?" Aveline's stomach dropped. This was it, the moment Fenris had been orchestrating all evening. "In fact," Fenris continued, "I took the liberty of inviting someone who can speak to that transformation firsthand. A gentleman who knew her Grace during her previous circumstances." The dining room doors opened, and Aveline's worst nightmare walked through them. Viscount Rothwell looked exactly as she remembered, handsome, charming, and utterly self-satisfied. He had aged well in the 2 years since their disastrous encounter, his fair hair artfully styled, his evening clothes cut to perfection. When his eyes found hers across the room, she saw not remorse, but amused condescension. "Rothwell, old friend," Fenris said warmly, "thank you for joining us. I believe you're acquainted with the Duchess?" The room went utterly silent, every eye fixed on Aveline, waiting to see how she would react to being confronted with the man who had publicly humiliated her. Rothwell bowed with theatrical courtesy. "Your Grace, what a pleasure to see you again. Though I confess, I almost didn't recognize you. You've changed so dramatically from the desperate girl who once sought my attention." Aveline felt herself fragmenting, the carefully constructed composure she'd maintained all evening cracking under the weight of old shame. This was what Fenris had planned, to reduce her once again to that humiliated girl, to prove to society and the magistrate that she was unstable, damaged, unworthy of being Damien's Duchess. She opened her mouth, though she had no idea what she could possibly say. But before she could speak, Damien rose from his seat with deliberate, controlled fury. "Rothwell!" His voice cut through the charged silence like a blade. "How unfortunate that you accepted this invitation. I had hoped never to waste my time in your presence." Rothwell's smile faltered. Your Grace, You merely what? Damien moved around the table with predatory grace. Accepted money from Fenris to come here and humiliate my wife? Or did you do it for free, out of the natural cruelty that seems to be your defining characteristic? Fenris stood as well, his expression hardening. Rentham, there's no need for unpleasantness. Rothwell, Damien continued as though Fenris hadn't spoken, publicly rejected a young woman at a ball 2 years ago. Not because she was lacking in character or quality, but because he was too much a coward to admit he'd been using her to make another woman jealous. Isn't that right, Rothwell? The Viscount's face flushed. That's a damned lie. Is it? Damien's smile was cold and sharp. Because I've spoken to several witnesses who confirmed that you were pursuing Lady Elizabeth Hartwick all that season. That you courted my wife solely to provoke Elizabeth's jealousy. And that you dropped Aveline the moment Elizabeth showed interest. You used her, humiliated her publicly when she was no longer useful to you, and then had the audacity to blame her for being desperate. Aveline stared at Damien in shock. He had investigated Rothwell's betrayal, had gathered evidence and witnesses, had prepared for this confrontation. But here's what you didn't count on, Rothwell, Damien continued, his voice dropping to something dangerous and intimate. That rejection was the best thing that ever happened to her, because it meant she was still available when I needed a wife. It meant that a woman of extraordinary strength, intelligence, and integrity was overlooked by fools like you who couldn't see past society's shallow judgments. He turned, his eyes finding Aveline across the room. My wife was rejected because she had the misfortune to trust a man unworthy of her. That doesn't make her damaged or desperate. It makes her human. And the fact that she survived that humiliation with her dignity intact, that she had the courage to accept my proposal, despite knowing it would expose her to exactly this kind of scrutiny, that makes her the strongest woman I've ever known. The room was utterly silent now, every guest transfixed by the Duke's passionate defense. Damien extended his hand to Aveline. Stand up, Duchess. She rose on trembling legs, her heart hammering against her ribs. He crossed to her, taking both her hands in his eyes burning with an intensity that stole her breath. I claimed you at a ball, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room. I claimed you because I needed a wife to secure a legal matter. That was true then. But if I were to lose every acre of Thornwood tomorrow, if the magistrate ruled against me and stripped away the estates my family has held for 2 centuries, I would still choose you. Not because you're convenient or useful or strategically valuable, but because I love you. Aveline's breath caught. The words she had been afraid to speak, afraid to even hope for, falling from his lips with absolute conviction. I love you, he repeated, his hands tightening on hers. I love your strength and your compassion and the way you've made my house a home. I love the way you challenge me and support me and refuse to let me retreat into the cold isolation I thought was safety. You are not the rejected maiden, Aveline. You are my Duchess, my partner, and the woman I choose every day. Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't care. Damien. He pulled her against him and kissed her. Not the brief, formal kiss of their wedding, but something fierce and possessive and utterly public, a claiming that left no doubt in anyone's mind that this marriage was real, that their connection ran far deeper than legal convenience. When he finally pulled back, his eyes never left hers. I love you, he whispered, just for her. And I need you to know that before we face tomorrow. I love you too, she managed through her tears. I have for weeks now, but I was afraid. No more fear. He turned, keeping her hand locked in his, addressing the room with cold authority. As for the Thornwood estates, Lord Fenris, you should know that my solicitors discovered something interesting while researching your challenge. The codicil you're using to contest the deed? It was added to the document 15 years after the original transfer, in handwriting that doesn't match any of the verified signatures. We've obtained testimony from the clerk who witnessed your father forge the addition in an attempt to create grounds for future dispute. Fenris had gone pale. That's a lie. It's documented fact, and the evidence will be presented to the magistrate tomorrow. Damien's smile was sharp and triumphant. Your challenge is based on a fraudulent document, Fenris. You have no claim to Thornwood, and after tomorrow, you'll be lucky if you're not facing criminal charges for attempting to use forged evidence in a legal proceeding. The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Fenris looked between Damien and the assembled guests, clearly calculating whether to continue his resistance or retreat. Finally, his shoulders sagged fractionally. This isn't over, Rentham. Oh, I think it is. Damien turned to Aveline, offering his arm. Come, Duchess. We've wasted enough time on people who don't matter. They walked out together through the stunned silence, leaving Fenris's carefully orchestrated humiliation in ruins behind them. And as their carriage pulled away from the townhouse, Aveline finally let herself believe that perhaps, just perhaps, they had won. The hearing lasted less than an hour. Lord Aldridge, the magistrate, reviewed the evidence of the forged codicil with increasingly grim expression, while Lord Fenris's solicitors scrambled to mount a defense that crumbled under the weight of documented proof. By noon, the judgment was rendered. The Thornwood estates remained uncontestably in the Duke of Rentham's possession, and Lord Fenris was ordered to pay court costs and submit to an inquiry into his use of fraudulent documents. Aveline watched from the gallery as Fenris departed the courtroom, his face ashen with defeat and barely suppressed fury. He didn't look at them as he passed, but the rigid set of his shoulders spoke volumes. He had gambled everything on breaking Damien through Aveline, and he had lost spectacularly. It's over, Damien said quietly beside her, his hand finding hers. Truly over. She turned to look at him, this man who had defended her so fiercely, who had declared his love before all of society, in the harsh light of day after the drama and intensity of the previous evening. She half expected to see regret in his expression, concern that he had revealed too much, promised more than he intended. But his eyes held only warmth and certainty. What happens now? She asked. Now, he said, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. I take my wife somewhere. We should have gone weeks ago. The carriage delivered them not to Rentham House, as Aveline expected, but to Ashford House in Mayfair. The season was long over, and the grand mansion stood quiet and mostly shuttered. But the caretaker's staff admitted them readily at the Duke's request. Why are we here? Aveline asked as Damien led her through the familiar corridors toward the ballroom. You'll see. The ballroom was dim, dust covers draped over furniture, the chandeliers unlit. Without the press of guests and the glow of hundreds of candles, it seemed smaller somehow, less intimidating. Just a room, beautiful but empty. Damien led her to a spot near the terrace doors, then turned to face her. Do you remember this place? Of course. How could she forget? This was where her life had changed, where Damien had appeared like some dark apparition and claimed her before all of London. This is where you declared me your future Duchess. This is where I claimed you out of necessity, he corrected gently. Where I saw a solution to my legal problems and seized it without thought for anything beyond securing the Thornwood estates. His hands came up to frame her face. I was cold and calculating and utterly certain I was in control of the situation. You were terrifying, Aveline admitted with a small smile. I thought you were either mad or playing some cruel joke. I was desperate. Fenris had backed me into a corner, and I needed a wife who couldn't be connected to his faction. When I saw you standing there, enduring Clarissa's cruelty with such dignity despite your fear, I recognized something. His thumb brushed across her cheekbone. Strength. Real strength. The kind that comes from surviving genuine hardship rather than performing for society's approval. I knew in that moment that you were exactly what I needed. A legal convenience, Aveline said, though there was no bitterness in her words now. They had both entered their arrangement with clear eyes and practical motivations. A necessity, Damien agreed. But Aveline, what I didn't understand then, what I couldn't have known, was that necessity would transform into something far more valuable. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. I claimed you here out of desperation, but I want to offer you something different now. Something freely given, with no contract or obligation forcing my hand. He opened the box, revealing a locket of delicate gold filigree, beautiful in its simplicity. The front was engraved with intertwined initials, A and D, woven together in an elegant script that made them nearly inseparable. It's beautiful, Aveline whispered. Open it. She lifted the locket from its cushion with trembling fingers and pressed the tiny clasp. Inside, on one side, was a miniature portrait of Damien, not the cold, remote Duke, but the man she had come to know, his expression warm and alive. On the other side, a lock of dark hair tied with silk ribbon, and beneath it, words engraved in letters so small she had to squint to read them. My heart, my home, my choice. Tears blurred her vision. Damien. I claimed you out of necessity, he said, taking the locket and moving behind her to fasten it around her neck. His fingers brushed against her nape, sending shivers down her spine. But I keep you out of love. That's the difference, Aveline. The claim was forced by circumstance. The keeping is entirely my choice. She turned in his arms, looking up at this complicated, wounded man who had somehow become everything to her. I spent 2 years believing that Rothwell's rejection defined my worth, that I was damaged and desperate and lucky to accept whatever scraps of affection anyone offered me. And now? His hand settled at her waist, solid and sure. Now I know that his rejection wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning. She reached up to cup his face, feeling the slight roughness of stubble against her palms. If he hadn't cast me aside, I would have married him. I would have spent my life with a man who saw me as a tool for his own purposes, who would have slowly ground down whatever strength I possessed. I would never have been standing in this ballroom when you needed someone. I would never have become your Duchess. You would never have become mine, Damien said softly, and the possessiveness in his voice sent heat flooding through her. I would never have learned what I was truly worth. Aveline smiled through her tears. You saw strength in me when I had forgotten I possessed any. You gave me responsibilities that let me prove my own capability. You defended me when I couldn't defend myself. And you refused to let me sacrifice myself to protect you. You loved me when I didn't think I deserved to be loved. You always deserved it, he said fiercely. From the moment I saw you standing alone at that ball, refusing to be cowed by Clarissa's cruelty, you deserved to be cherished. I was just too much a fool to recognize it immediately." She laughed, the sound slightly watery. "We were both fools. I was so afraid of admitting I loved you, terrified that you would see it as manipulation or emotional weakness." "I was afraid of the same thing," Damien admitted. "Afraid that if I acknowledged what I felt, you would use it as Catherine did. But Aveline, you're nothing like her. Where she used my trust as a weapon, you've used it as a foundation. You've never asked me for anything beyond respect and honesty. I'm asking for something now." She looked up at him, her heart in her eyes. "I'm asking you to kiss me here, in this room where you claimed me. Not as the Duke claiming his convenient Duchess, but as my husband who loves me." "With pleasure, wife." He lowered his head, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that was tender and fierce in equal measure. His arms tightened around her, pulling her closer, and she melted into him. Finally, free of the shame and doubt that had shadowed her for so long. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Damien rested his forehead against hers. "I need to confess something." "What?" "I'm glad Rothwell rejected you." At her surprised laugh, he continued, "I'm glad every man before me was too blind to see your worth, because it means you were available when I needed you. It means I get to be the one who keeps you." Aveline reached up to touch the locket at her throat, feeling its weight settle against her skin like a promise. "The rejected maiden," she mused. "That's what they called me. What some probably still call me." "Let them," Damien said with a slight smile. "We both know the truth. You were never rejected, Aveline. You were being saved for something better. For this. For us. For love," she agreed softly. "For love," he repeated, and kissed her again. Outside, London went about its business. Society already moving on to the next scandal, the next drama. But in the quiet ballroom, where a desperate duke had once claimed a rejected maiden, two people stood wrapped in each other's arms, transformed by the unexpected alchemy of necessity becoming devotion. The Duchess of Wrentham wore a locket over her heart, engraved with her husband's promise. And for the first time since a cruel boy had humiliated her in a room not unlike this one, Aveline Hartwell believed she was exactly where she belonged. The claim had given her security, but love had given her something far more valuable. The absolute certainty of her own worth, reflected in the eyes of a man who had chosen her not once, but over and over again. A man who had seen her at her most vulnerable and called her strong. A man who had defended her honor when she couldn't defend it herself. A man who loved her, not despite her past, but with full knowledge of it. "Take me home," she whispered against his lips. "To Wrentham Hall?" he asked. "To wherever you are," Aveline replied. "That's home now." Damien smiled, a real smile, warm and unguarded, the kind he only ever gave her. "Then let's go home, Duchess. We have a life to build together." They left the ballroom hand in hand, the door closing softly behind them. In the empty room, dust motes danced in the fading afternoon light, settling gently on the spot where a duke had once made a claim that changed two lives forever. Where necessity had blossomed into love. Where the rejected maiden had become a cherished duchess. Where two wounded souls had found, against all odds, exactly what they needed in each other. My beautiful family, you know I care about you all. If you made it all the way, to the end, you just invested over an hour in Aveline and Damien's love story. You witnessed her transformation from rejected maiden to cherished duchess. You felt every moment of their journey from cold contract to burning love. And now I'm going to be brutally honest with you. Only 12% of you who watched this actually subscribed. That means 88% of you will miss my next story. And I've already written something even more emotionally devastating. A marriage of convenience between enemies who can't stop touching each other. A heroine with a secret that could destroy them both. You just spent an hour here. Don't let this be the last story we share together. Subscribe right now. Drop a comment telling me your favorite moment. Was it the ballroom claim? The chapel confession? The final confrontation? And if this story made you feel something, share it with someone who needs to believe in love today. They'll thank you for it. I'll see you in the next one if you subscribe. At the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another powerful story from our channel. Click it and let yourself be surprised by even more unforgettable emotions with love. The Victorian Royal Stories team.